and welcome to this powerful installation of Women of Color's community-led public education campaign on adverse childhood experiences. I'm Dr. Pam Ross McLean, and I am honored to be your moderator for tonight's live radio discussion, Breaking the Cycle, Healing Our Families from ACEs. For over 30 years, Women of Colors has been a force of healing, empowerment, and equity right here in Saginaw County. Since the founding in 1993, we've focused on promoting community wellness and youth development through culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and evidence-based programs. From Botman's Life Skills Training to Prime for Life or Stronger Together, mental wellness series, our goal has always been to create safe, supportive spaces where people can grow, connect, and thrive. This work wouldn't be possible without the support of our incredible partners. We're grateful for organizations like Mid-State Health Network, Michigan Health Endowment Fund, Saginaw Community Mental Health Authority, My Michigan Health Center, TRICAP, Peer 360, and many, many more that I wish I had time to name. Tonight's ACE Public Education campaign is made possible through generous funding from Michigan Public Health Institute. Thanks to this support, we're expanding access to services that blend professional care and peer-led support, like our newly certified peer support specialists who walk along individuals on their journey of healing. This evening, we're shining a light on childhood trauma, calling it out, breaking the silence, and exploring what it takes to build healthy pathways for our families and communities. I am excited to be joined by an extraordinary panel of community advocates, leaders whose lived experience and professional expertise will help us unpack ACEs and explore what it truly means and how we can truly heal. Let me introduce these inspiring voices. We have with us Teresina L. Jackson, author of The Code of Silence, Dirty Little Secrets, whose courageous storytelling gives voice to generational pain and lights a path towards truth and liberation. We also have Dr. Kai Anderson, a board-certified psychiatrist and nationally recognized ACEs expert, offering clinical insight and a deep commitment to mental wellness and trauma recovery. We also have Dana Simmons, master social worker, a passionate social worker and trauma specialist with hands-on experience supporting families through adversity and guiding them towards resilience. And last but certainly never least, Mr. Jimmy Green, a respected corporate executive whose wonderful personal journey reminds us that trauma knows no boundaries and that transformation is possible when pain is met with purpose. Together, we are going to dig into the truth about ACEs and explore how families, schools, workplaces, and entire communities can become agents for healing. This is not just a conversation, it is a call to action. And I'll just say that when Women of Colors got the opportunity to take up this topic, I thought this is a very, very important topic for us to be able to dig into and talk about, because when you start studying about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, you'll find that in many of our lived experiences, some of these things have just been normalized to the point where we don't even acknowledge that they are traumatizing forces. And so with that, let's open up our first segment, Lifting the Code of Silence, by inviting each of our panelists to share their why. What brought you to this work, and why is the conversation about ACEs so critical, especially right now? So we'll start with you, Dr. Kai. If you can help our listeners understand what ACEs are, and can you explain what we mean by adverse childhood experiences and how they impact people's lives long term?
Well, thank you, Dr. Pam. I'd like to start by defining trauma. Trauma are events that occur that are beyond our abilities to cope with them. It's our responses, those emotional, psychological responses that undermine our ability to cope, that we're going to talk about tonight. Everybody responds to trauma differently. It's based on your personality, the support that you have. how old you are, the environment that you're in. And your body actually holds the trauma. You may find yourself shaking. You may have stomach aches. You may have flashbacks, nightmares. Those are all signs that your body is responding to a traumatic event. Now, ACEs are adverse childhood experiences that occur that are traumatic, that have negative, lasting effects on your health and your well-being. The term ACEs was first coined in the 1990s by Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti, and they identified 10 ACEs, which range from physical, emotional, or sexual abuse to parental divorce or the incarceration of a parent or guardian. I'm going to show you a slide that kind of breaks down the ACEs. If you can show the first slide, please. So as you see, these are examples of ACEs. Being exposed to physical abuse, being exposed to parental separation, being exposed to sexual abuse, having someone in your family that has mental illness, being exposed to emotional neglect, being exposed to intimate partner violence. Someone in your family may have gone to jail or prison, or being exposed to emotional abuse or physical neglect. Now, I like to emphasize that ACEs are not only in one particular demographic. They can occur to anyone. And in fact, they are common. In the study that Dr. Andy and Dr. Folletti did in the 1990s, they found that in this particular study, this was a study of individuals who were primarily white, college educated, that had health insurance, that were working, that 26% of these individuals had been exposed to at least one ACE. And in fact, over 12% of them had been exposed to 4 or more ACEs. So they're very common. I like to also add additional ACEs. And going to the next slide, this is a study that was done in 2012, 2017 by the Philadelphia ACEs Project. And what the initial ACEs study left out, they added. And that is what we see in some of our neighborhoods, where people are discriminated against because of their race, their ethnicity, their sexual gender, their sexual or gender attraction. We may be exposed to seeing violence in your community, where you may feel unsafe in your neighborhood, where you may have been in foster care, may have been exposed to bullying. And these other ACEs were added to the initial 10 ACEs developed by Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti. So those are examples of ACEs. And Dr. Pam, you asked me, you can take the slide down, thank you. You asked me how ACEs impact you. ACEs can lead to so many different things in our lives. They can affect our health. They can lead to chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease. They can lead to early smoking, early sexual encounters. They lead to you being a victim of sexual abuse, to you marrying someone that has a substance use dependence disorder. In fact, they can even lead to loss of life. Several studies have shown that individuals that have 4 more ACEs die 20 years earlier. Can you imagine that? 20 years earlier because of the exposure to ACEs. I also like to emphasize that this is not predetermined, however. These ACEs are mitigated by positive experiences. So just because you've been exposed to them doesn't mean you're going to have these adverse outcomes. So there is hope, and please don't forget that there's hope even though you've been exposed to ACEs. And I will stop there.
So can I just ask a quick follow-up question? Because I know you talked about the different cultural factors that could affect how people perceive ACEs. And so to date myself, I went to school when teachers could take out a paddle and beat you in class in front of everybody for getting out of line. And I had parents who encouraged them to beat me if I got out of line. I had parents who said, spare the rod and spoil the child. And so what would you say to listeners who are saying, you know, we've always had to, especially in the African-American community, police our children, correct our children, lest the world police our children and correct our children. So how does that align up with what you're saying about these ACEs? Because that's not our reality. What do you say to that? Because I hear what you're saying, and when you know better, you do better, and I want to do better. So,
well, first of all, I think that's a very good question. I like to differentiate between discipline and physical abuse. Mm-hmm. Discipline, where you're correcting someone because of something they did, is teaching that child to do better. Abuse is when you're physically harming that child, leaving marks on that child, damaging them psychologically. So I think that in some communities, we discipline with physical methods, and although we don't encourage that, it doesn't mean that it's always abusive. So there are lines, there are gradations of what we consider to be physical abuse. And I think it's important to think about the context as we think about some of these ACEs. Also,
you know what? No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Also, I'd like to add that ACEs are inherited. Studies have shown that generational trauma, because of historical events, because of racism, because of slavery, because of years of incarceration. These patterns are transmitted through families, both through behaviors and seeing your parents do this, and also through our genes, actually. Our genes are changed because we're exposed to these chronic stressful environments, and that increases our risk for disease. So there's so many ways that we're affected by these experiences.
Wow. Thank you for that. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to turn to Teresina now, and I would love for you to talk about your book a little bit, titled Code of Silence, Dirty Little Family Secrets. What is the cost of silence in families, and how does that relate to ACEs? Because even without just the knowledge that Dr. Kai lifted up about how things can be passed on from generation to generation, if we're not talking about these issues with the right words, we won't know that line she just described between abuse and discipline. But one of the things that your book brings out is that we have learned not to talk about these things that have been passed on for generations. So could you speak a little bit about what that cost of silence has been for families and how that relates to ACEs?
Yes, Dr. Pam, thank you for having me. I believe personally for myself, the cost of silence meant that you started to inflict that harm upon yourself. Not being able to speak about the things that were happening to you, and or when you chose to speak about the things that were happening to you, you were punished for those things. And again, that then turned into self-harm. And so you start to mirror the ACEs that are reported, substance abuse. You start to experience mental dis-ease in the body. And then you start to inflict that harm upon your children, whether you mean to or not. So that's what the Code of Silence, cost us. It cost us. We start to avoid those conversations. And then with those patterns show up in our children.
Thank you for lifting that up. All right. So Dana, from a social work perspective, how do you see ACEs showing up in everyday life for families, especially those who might not even know this language? Because the more we normalize the language and put it out there, I don't think that there's any sector who hasn't seen the evidence of ACEs impacting families, but give us your sense of their prevalence.
Dr. Pam, thanks again, and thanks for having me as part of this panel. To the reference of your question, how do we see ACEs and how this show up through behaviors? As Dr. Kai mentioned earlier, it's behaviors. It's the manifesting of physical and mental behaviors and other, riskful behaviors, promiscuity, different types of things it takes on because of the maladaptive way that, the ACEs has caused us to, or caused individuals to adapt to the trauma that they've experienced. And then also too, based on the stages of life where that trauma occurred, it causes, and at any stages, it causes arrested development. And that arrested development is the emotional and the psychological level where the body keeps growing throughout all of the stages. There is, again, that person. So for instance, if trauma happened at age 5, the person continues to grow, but their ability to react is going to be that of an infantile perspective of a 5-year-old, because that at that time, from birth to 5, that brain is still developing, and it's developing synapses and things that are happening in the environment. So if that stops because of trauma, that is how that person is going to emotionally and physically respond to any similar like might occur. So it's so just understanding like the stages and the different things that are happening with children and what's going on and how to, to recognize that behaviors is the biggest language. Why that child can't sit still, if it hears a noise, if someone walks in, if someone wears a certain type of cologne and their abuser wore that cologne. So those behaviors, we have to start learning how to tune into reading and listening to behaviors because they don't have the verbalization to articulate the pain, the hurt, and it's confusing to them. So behaviors is definitely the language that's utilized, and that is become the common basis of how they're letting the world know something has happened, but I don't know how to tell you.
Thank you. You know, listening to you talk about that as plainly as you did, it reminds me of growing up in the church. And I can remember once they preached and they said, children pay for the sins of their parents. And I sat there thinking to myself, well, that doesn't feel fair, you know. And I had that kind of mind as a child, and mouth got me in lots of trouble. But when you think about what we are talking about here, how you can have genetic predispositions based on trauma that has occurred in your family. I mean, that's heavy duty stuff to even know. So when we know these things, I think it helps us to not continue to perpetuate those cycles, but also to know what we're looking at and what is the source of those behaviors. But as all things, we don't, you know, where there is knowledge, there is hope. And so I think it's really important that we're having these conversations. So I'm going to turn now to Jimmy. Jimmy, your journey from childhood adversity to corporate leadership challenges assumptions to some extent. Can you speak about how ACEs have impacted your journey and why this conversation is especially important for men? Because, and I'll just add this caveat. A lot of people look at women as being overwhelmingly the object of adverse childhood experiences. And probably about a month ago, I sat in a room of 5 beautiful women, myself included, and we got into a conversation and realized that every one of us had experienced ACEs. Every one of us had, to varying degrees. And they had impacted our lives in various ways. But we also knew that there was hope on the other side of that. And we had to lift up the fact that this is not something that males don't also experience. And so we appreciate you being able to talk about how ACEs impacted your life, but yet here you are, successful and advocating for empowering and educating others.
It's funny, you know, the question how you got here, and I mean this sincerely. I don't know. Like I'm at an age where you think you should have a pat answer for that, but I don't. I sometimes question how I got here, why I'm even here. There is a humility, and you're right about assumptions. I think people, when you say the word successful, and I come across very confident. It's a nature, but it's a shield for me. There is a humility in the way I came to this place right here. I started writing down notes, listening to Kai. I went through physical abuse, parental separation, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, violence, emotional abuse, and physical neglect. Like that was, I could go back to when I was 5 years old, and that's funny you mentioned that age, where all of that started. And when you're journeying through that, this idea that survival never crosses a 5-year or a 6-year-old mind. You don't even know what's happening to you. What's funny about that is I don't think I even knew what happened to me until I was old enough to understand what had happened to me. And by then, I think I was more worried about being more sociopathic than I was anything else, because when people talk about shutting down the things that hurt you most, it was the only way I could do that. And I will tell you this, and it's really ironic that when people ask me how you got here, there was this, I grew up with alcoholic parents. My mother was very violent when she got drunk, and she was drunk all the time. I was the oldest of 6. I had a baby sister, and so I always had this sort of protective thing. And I didn't know that at the time. And it's so funny you should talk about how you got to corporate leadership, and you realize that your leadership started when you were protecting your siblings when you're 7 and 8 years old. So I used to always put myself in the way. When my mother got violent, I would hear it. I would hear her coming. And so I'd always put myself in the way of my brothers and my sister, and I would take her beatings. And by the time she was tired, she never messed with my siblings. And it's interesting because it just felt like that was the way to do it. But I also learned something when I got older. When people said, "So how did you get here?" I said there was a conscious decision that I made about my mother and my father, and I didn't want to be like them. And my mother and father's behaviors were always governed by alcohol. And it's ironic because of my personality. I've never had alcohol in my life. And people find that amazing, which is kind of terrible in a way, because I can never explain my behavior on it as a result of alcohol. So people know when I do and what I say is deliberate. But when you get to this place, it's still a discovery. And I know that sounds kind of weird. And when I talked about the code of silence, when you talked about that, that was my whole life. Like I was afraid of opening up and talking about the trauma and the things that happened to me because I was embarrassed about it. There was a shame I carried as if somehow I was responsible for everything that ever happened to me. And so you spend your life running, like hiding and, not letting people know all of this. You know what it's like for a man to admit that he's been a victim of sexual abuse? You know what that does to a male psyche, especially when you're growing up and keeping it real, being a man and all that. I mean, the idea that you would drop that shield and admit to something like that. I mean, it took me a long, long, long time to get to a place where I felt like I could actually be open and have this kind of conversation. So when you talk about why do this, the humility in me says I am nobody special, that there are so many men I know who probably have gone through this kind of trauma and they see me as this model of success. I don't, they may, but if this opens the door for them to say, well, hell, if he can get there, maybe I can too, then I think it's important for me to have these kind of conversations, to be on these kind of forums, even though I'm still in a place of discovery. And I don't know if I'll ever get to a place where I get it all, but it's kind of a fun journey now to not be afraid of where you come from and who you've become.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that because I struggle sometimes now because on the one hand, the more we talk about these things, the more we lift up people's knowledge. And so I think all of us who have lived experience, who can share with other folks that there's hope on the other side of that, I think that's important. But it's also important for us to hopefully, stop these ACEs from being perpetuated. Like you, I grew up seeing substance misuse, and people find it hard to believe that I never wanted to get high or never wanted to get drugs, but at the same time, it could have the opposite effect on somebody else who's going through those things. So there's no rhyme or reason, as you said, but it's good for people to be able to see examples of multiple ways of coping and multiple ways of overcoming. And many of us have lived through adversity, but we don't always recognize how it shapes the way we love, the way we parent, the way we live. And so I'd like to explore that a little bit more, because as the old folks say, when you know better, you can do better, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about generational patterns, mental health, and substance misuse. In Saginaw County, 30% of caregivers or parents report frequent mental distress. This begs the question, what's going on in our communities emotionally? And why are so many caregivers struggling, in many cases, silently? And so, Dr. Kyle, I'll ask you again, what happens when parents' mental health needs go unaddressed?
I'd like to start by talking about that statistic you just referenced. 30% experience mental distress. I think I experience distress because of what's going on in the nation right now. There's so many things that are going on that it's really hard not to have mental distress. But going back to your question about parents, our parents are the foundation. They're the base. And if that base has cracks in it, the family suffers. So we have to make sure that we support those parents. And otherwise it's a domino effect. For example, when Jimmy talked about his experience, Teresina talked about her experience, I can talk about my experiences. But when the parents are affected, the children don't really know how to respond to it. You know, as a child, you're just trying to make it through. You're just trying to survive. So as a child, you may act out, you may withdraw. That may cause the parent to have a reaction, and then the circle continues. The parent does something, you do something, and the circle continues. And essentially, no one gets better if no one makes that first step and says, I need help, my family needs help, something is going on. And frequently, as a psychiatrist, what I see, they'll bring that child in, they'll start talking about things, ask them questions about their upbringing, and they recognize, hey, maybe I can use some help as well. So I say, just take that step, talk about things, don't have that code of silence, and let's get the whole family getting some help.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So, Dana, could you talk to us a little bit about whether or not you think that there may be a link between unresolved trauma and substance misuse across generations?
Yes. There is truly a correlation when, as Dr. Kai mentioned, when things are not addressed and trauma is not addressed, you can't make changes. And when that foundation has those cracks in it, and as Mr. Green has indicated too, the things that are in that primary environment at that time of that child's development, it's going to have an imprint and a lasting impression on that child. So when there is heavy substance use or just substance use, and I wrote in my notes just to think about it, I said trauma and substance abuse hang out like wet clothes. They hang out together. And because of the trauma, the maladaptive behavior is formulated to help function and to cope with that. So then something is needed to numb those feelings or to keep those feelings at bay or to continue to suppress those feelings, because I don't have the tools and the wherewithal and understanding of my trauma enough to even talk about it. So if I could drink it away, if I could pop it away, if I can snort it and shoot it away, I will. And it becomes a way to just manage, and it becomes that maladaptive way of managing, but becomes the norm that is structured in that environment. And so it's a situation just finding out, that relative source of the trauma and addressing it. And it's hard for some people, and it's hard for families who, have not had or been exposed to the opportunity to even begin to understand. I can think about my parents, and I can think about my grandparents, and think about some of the things that as a kid I saw, and didn't understand why that one particular uncle who came back from Vietnam, he acted the way he acted, why those things were the way they were, and why was, you had to know a certain way to approach him because you made too much noise. It was just the behavior, the maladaptive way that he dealt with trauma. And again, substance and what I saw in my early environment was oftentimes used as a Tylenol to take away the pain. And that's what it did. But it was always, temporal. It was always a temporary situation solution. And it took away the pain, but it also created other things because that avoidance is always there. And trauma is kind of like the boogeyman that's always poking you, will always let you know I'm still here. So what you gonna do? So it takes from one thing, you got to get stronger. You start moving on and using more and more and more, because as you go through that life cycle, that inability to deal with whatever that trauma was, let alone the crisis and the ebb and flow of life, it adds on to it. Trauma just is like a big old garbage can. It just keeps collecting and collecting and collecting until somebody closes the lid and say, okay, enough is enough.
I'm glad that we've gotten, I'm glad that we are shining a light on the fact that similar traumas affect people differently. There's no one size way of people responding to trauma. And I try to be very mindful of that. Some people will see a bad example and they will become worse than the bad example.
Mhm.
They will outdo the bad example. And other people will see a bad example and they'll go in the complete opposite direction. But clearly, both parties are dealing with unresolved trauma. And so,
Sure.
Teresina, you've written about your lived experience. Could you talk about some of the things that your family's generational story, how you were impacted, and how you were able to take that narrative and turn it in a way to heal your hidden wounds, if you will?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. What I thought about is that, me and my brother grew up in the same household, but we're having different experiences in life. I traveled a very different journey than he traveled. Our mother was addicted to drugs for as long as I can remember, whether it was alcohol or a substance of some sort. We were experiencing her different. I realized that in my experience, my mother's addiction turned into mental disease in my body. As a small child, I could recognize what was happening in my household. I had somewhat of a voice at some point in time in speaking out in what was happening, and then the code of silence. And you begin to get silenced with shame and punishment. You begin to be called crazy and a liar. Somehow their traumas turn into your traumas. You become the scapegoat. And so I was being seen in mental health institutions as though there was something wrong with me, and I was pointing out that there was something going on in the household. And at that era in time, it just, it was able to fall upon deaf ears. And so I spent a lot of time being diagnosed with different things, but no one never necessarily dealing with those unresolved traumas. It took, like Dr. Kai said, and even Mr. Green said, until I got older to kind of understand that I wasn't crazy. I seen what I seen, but I began to mirror those same things because I didn't understand what was happening in my body. When you talk about the hidden wounds, I didn't understand dysregulation. I didn't understand that the inflammation, that was the pain that I was experiencing on the inside was, that mental health, that unresolved trauma. As I got older and started to heal, I could reflect back and starting to look at how my grandmother parented, or how my father behaved, or how my aunts and uncles interacted, or certain things that happened to me that I could see happening to my cousins. And I could start to make sense of, oh, this is addiction. Oh, this is trauma. Oh, this is what's happening here, and the silence that happens and what it cost us to not have those conversations, and then having to really take back your own power and start to begin to define your own truth, unpack a lot of that, unlearn a lot of that, because it doesn't stay hidden. It, like Dana said, it shows up in your behavior. It shows up in your relationships. It shows up in your inability to communicate. It shows up in your inability to hold employment. It shows up in your children and their inability to function in the world, and they start to have that dis-ease in their body. And so again, it's passed down, and being able to, see the generational trauma and then be able to start to disrupt that.
I tell you, you've talked about silence, and I think sometimes we just don't talk about the things in the way that you just did. But then there are other times when we don't even have the right words to use. Do you know what I mean? You don't even know how to name what you've experienced as trauma, because for many people, that's just the way my life is. You know what I mean? And so you're perpetuating something that if we name it for what it is and talk more about the long-term impacts of it, we might be able to start breaking that cycle, because it's not going to go away on its own, for sure. So thank you for sharing your story and shining a light so that other people can see that they're not alone, and also see someone who's come out in working through. So thank you for that. Jimmy, I know you said you don't know what you did to get where you are, and I can respect that, but I would love to hear about what gave you the courage to tell your story in service of others, I guess you could say, because as you said earlier, very few men want to join the Me Too movement, or very few men want to say, you know, I experience the kinds of things that we call ACEs. And as a mother of two sons, I've come to realize, as I have awakened, that just because I have boys doesn't mean that I don't need to watch out for my boys in the same way I would if I had daughters. We have so many stereotypical ways of thinking, but a lot of men don't share those vulnerabilities. So could you say more about your what gave you the courage to not only tell your story, but to chart a new course? Because to say out loud, I don't drink because, you know what I mean? And there's a lot of people who feel that sentence is by saying, I drink because, and you know what I'm, so could you say a little bit about that? Because that's intriguing.
Yeah, I you know, it's funny. It's hard for me to get to one place without talking about the genesis of how I even got here, to tell you the truth. And you know, I was 7 years old, and this is something that didn't even get resolved until 3 years ago. So I spent 54 years of my life in secret. I was 7 years old, and I watched my mother kill my uncle. And I was sitting on the stairs New Year's Day, and they were arguing, and they were drinking, and everybody was drunk, and I couldn't sleep. And to this very day, people talk about my sleep patterns, and I have terrible, terrible sleep patterns. And I heard them arguing. I climbed out of bed, and I went to the steps, and I could look up, and I looked up over the stairs because we were on a 3-story house. And I looked up, and they're yelling, and I literally watched my mother push my uncle over the railing. He subsequently fell, broke his neck, and died. And everybody ran down. I could hear all this screaming. And my mother was the last one, and she saw me on the steps. Everybody else ran past me. And my mother grabbed me by the throat. And she saw me, and she said, if you say anything, if you saw anything, I will kill you. And she ran down the stairs. That was the first or second memories I ever had as a child. And we grew up in the projects. We were at my grandma's house when that happened. And we grew up in the projects in Flint. Just terrible poverty. I mean, I had the worst childhood you can even imagine. And sometimes people just find it almost hard to believe. My kids really do. Like, my kids had no idea of how I grew up, and they are so far removed from it. It's difficult to have my kids understand me. Like, they can't. And that's always been a hardship for me. So you talk about how I got here. I was thinking all the mistakes that I've made along the way was this suffering and silence thing. And that's why that book, you talk about that code of silence. I'm telling you that. And when I saw the title, I was like, oh my God, it's like been the trademark of my life. So I created all these things that I wouldn't have to, where I didn't have to deal with that lie, that secret, that family secret. And I thought about all those different things. And I thought about, when you talked about how you got here and what generational patterns, it was a lot of those things. When I said I didn't drink and alcohol, I want you to think about that for a minute. It was a year later, my mother decided to leave us for the night to go get a job. It was a year later, she came back and got us. She moved to California. We were stuck with the neighbors, me and my brothers and my sister. That's where we got traumatized and we were treated like servants. They were older than we were. When I keep thinking about all those different things, my dad was gone, and we had all this shame, all this abuse around me. So when you talk about generational patterns, all I could think about at the time was not wanting to be. And I said this earlier, like, I didn't want to be my dad, because I always felt like my dad should have been there to protect us. And so, and my mom, who I absolutely hated, I despised my mother. And it was really weird, because when my mother died about 17 years ago, I remember calling my brothers up and I said, does anybody have anything nice to say about her? And we didn't. Because my mother never said she loved me. My mother never hugged me. My mother never did any of these things. Now, it's important to know why I'm saying this. Because if you know me in the community, what's the first thing I do is I hug. I hug everybody, even to the point where it might make them uncomfortable. I'm a hugger. It's how I release. I don't know what the psychological part of that is. I really don't. I've never sat back and tried to figure that out, but I know I still, even at this age, have this compulsion, this need to just hug it out, to be intimate with people without crossing the line, and I think I've been more closer to women than I have men as a result of that. Maybe there's some safety thing that they feel. I don't know, but I know that it feeds me. And when I think about all the generational things, what I wasn't afraid of was intimacy. I don't, and when I say I don't know how I got there, I don't know why I do what I do, but I know it comforts me, and I know that it's genuine and it feels good to have that, even at this age. You think that there's this place where you get over that hump. I don't know if you ever do. That need, that thirst to just feel wanted, to not feel abandoned. Those are the kind of things. And one of the things, and I've been divorced, and I know why. I did figure that out, because the moment a woman yelled at me, I shut down. Like I don't want to engage. I don't talk. I am literally numb to, and that takes away your ability to fight, to stay in a marriage, to get past that. And every yell, every fight, every scream, I get more distant to the point I don't even feel like I'm there. And so it's easy to separate. It's easy to divorce. It's easy to get out of a relationship, because those wounds still were there. And I never had those healed. And so there are just so many different parts of me that it's difficult to, use in a 5 or 6 minute scope of time. But that's why I say this discovery in me allows me to tell my own narrative, to tell my own story. And there's a liberation in that. Like, I'm not afraid to do that anymore. And maybe that's just part of me trying to keep discovering that. And maybe it's still a part of me that wants my kids to understand who I am too, because I've become the dad that my dad should have been. I'm a hell of a father. I'm not a good spouse. I think I will be, but there's a part of me that almost felt like I only had so much to give, and protecting my children and being a dad to my children was the most important thing to me. And I don't think I ever really learned that balance. So yeah, it's a long way to get there. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but you almost have to understand my genesis before I could even talk about the me today. You'd have to understand how I got here, because I'm still trying to figure that out myself.
No, you did answer the question, and I appreciate what you're saying as you figure out your narrative. And I think it's good for you to still be open to figuring out your narrative and making sense of who you are and why you do what you do. And so we certainly wouldn't want our listeners to think that we've got this figured out, because what's very clear to me is trauma affects everybody differently. And I think the mistake we make is when we say, well, I had a bad example and I chose not to do this. Why did you lean into that? Why are you becoming the... It's different for everyone. But what I'm hoping that the message will be for our listeners is that there is hope, that there is healing, that childhood traumas are a real thing. So I'm wondering, any of you, what do we say to families who feel shame or guilt when they realize that they themselves and their kids are living with unhealed pain? What do we say to them?
Can I say something real quick on that?
Yes, please.
I had something that I literally almost tattooed in my mind a long, long, long time ago. And I don't know if I heard it or if I made it up. I have no idea. I'm sure I probably heard it somewhere. But the thing that stayed tattooed in my mind was that I am my parents' child, but I am not my parents' choices. Mm-hmm. And that for me became such a powerful thing in my head that it literally, I'm not kidding you, it became comfort food for me. And maybe that was the reinforcement I had in not doing or following their behavior patterns that you suggested in the last question, that I'm not their choices. I'm just their child. And that, I think maybe our listeners, if somebody out there to just reconcile that yeah, they're just things that happen to us, but you don't have to let those be your choices. I mean, at the end of the day, my kids should be better than me. And for me, if I meet my maker tonight, I know I'm better than my parents were. And I think that's the healing part of it for me too, the beginning of it anyway.
Thank you for that. Choice is a big thing. Thank you for lifting that up. Well, Well, our next segment actually talks about pathways to healing and resilience, because we do realize what we've said earlier, and Dr. Kai, I don't think we said any better than you did, that we can inherit trauma. We can have genetic precursors, to use the word you use, that affect us, but we can also heal. And so, Dana, can you maybe break down a little bit about what a protective factor is and how we can be a buffer for that trauma? If you recall what Jimmy just got through saying,
yeah, that was powerful, Mr. Green.
I would make sure that my kids didn't experience what I knew way too much about. So could you maybe tease out for our listeners what those protective factors are that we can do to, offset or mitigate or make sure that ACEs aren't taking root?
No, for sure. And as I said earlier, I mean, Mr. Green, what you said is right on point, because those protective factors that are in society, and oftentimes there's about 5 that are usually identified, and that's parental resilience. And that kind of goes back and speaks to what he was speaking about, is parents who have, and then as himself, he has learned, how to cope and understand what trauma is and learn to address it, so that, again, you can't teach what you don't know, and you can't share and provide experiences if you haven't had the experience to work through it, to identify it and work through it. So parental resilience is definitely learning how to cope with the stresses of everyday life, the ebb and flow of life, the highs and lows, and then just being able to model some behaviors that are consistent, but provide a safe space for conversation. The other one is social and emotional competence of the child, and that's often received by, it's the children receive that by that parent who have practiced the parental resilience and have come to understand what that is all about. And that is just, being able to teach your child in a very nurturing environment and allow positive relationships to formulate so that they can ask questions and it be a safe place where correction can come in and correction can stay, as opposed to it being punitive and then, made to feel shameful for having experienced it or, anything. So it's a platform which allows the parents to foster that type of, I will not allow you to be like or experience what I went through. Parental understanding of childhood development is another one that's really, really, really important. And I see this in a lot of my work, is that when individuals are having children and then it's at that stage of growth and development, they really do not understand what is happening in the developmental stages, how the mind and how the body is formulating and how things are happening and what's happening. And so understanding child development also will help you to adjust when that time for parenting skills to adjust as they enter those stages. So you cannot sit and, parent a 13-year-old like a 5-year-old, because there are different stages in developmental behaviorals that they're experiencing. And so understanding, and again, having that social emotional competence and an environment that allows them to come and talk and come and learn, and then be able to practice that new learned skill so that they can understand as things change in their life. The other is parental support, and that is just having a network of people to help support you. How about creating those villages? We don't hear of individuals creating those villages of people, to assist them. And I know for me, when I moved to the States and moved to Michigan and everything, it was really important that I start to develop a village because at that time, moving from one country to another and with a small child, I really had to learn how to depend on others. And a lot of times it's not easy. But when you are given a safe space to adjust and to learn what you need, and that allows you to have the voice to ask for what you need as well. And so with that, and when I say that village can consist of, definitely structured by the parental, structured by the parental values and morals that are structured, then also programming, such as after school programming, different community things, Boys and Girls Club, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, neighborhood rec centers, and things that really embrace the value of keeping children safe and allowing children to have a space to experiment where they are in their developmental stage. So those protective factors are very important. And then also in those factors, consistency and formulation is also positive experiences, creating positive childhood experiences, PCEs. And those are the things that also, will help when trauma happens, or if trauma has happened, to create a different, brain connection. So, it's so important. It is so important how we see things and how we disseminate and teach, those that we're connected to.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Especially in the sense that parents don't have to do it all by themselves. It does take that village. And of course, you have to make sure that all the villagers are on the same plan for how to support and nurture our young people. Some of the comments that have come up is just letting people know that there is support out there, that there are groups who want to help with that, supporting and nurturing our children. And so a lot of times you use the word resilience several times. And Dr. Kai, can you share a little bit about the science of resilience and what our brains do? What do brains need to recover when they have been experiencing trauma?
Well, Jimmy, Dana, and Teresina have kind of already talked about what our brains need to recover. And it's those positive experiences, having someone that says, I see you, I see what's going on, I'm here to help you. It could be your grandmother, it could be your neighbor, it could be your teacher. Just sitting with someone and letting them know that they can feel comfortable and they can have that safe space to talk. That's a positive experience. And through that process, your brains are recovering. And the more times that it happens, the more your brains are recovering. So we take those as normal everyday experiences. Everybody doesn't have access to those normal everyday experiences. I see a question in the chat from Vicky. If you see a child and they're suffering, smile at that child. Let that child know that you have your safe space. And maybe that child will come and talk to you about what's going on in their home. And the other things that are really helpful are just enjoying life, dancing, those rhythmic experiences, yoga, drumming, exercising. All those things reset our brains and help our brains to function in a better way. Walking, spending time with your family, rapping, all those things are positive experiences. You're muted, Dr. Pam.
Oh, okay. I muted myself that time. So thank you. Thank you for sharing those things, because a lot of times, I really got fascinated by brain research a while back. And so sometimes we can think of the need for recovery to be this heady thing, but the way you just explained it, it's just giving yourself time to decompress and do happy things. And so on that note, Teresina, can you talk a little bit about your path to healing and how writing played a role in your transformation?
Dr. Pam, for me, I feel like I've always been on the healing path in one way, shape, or form. At a young age, I just didn't understand what that path was. I can remember, and I tell this story being 15, where I did start to understand that I wasn't my parents' choices and that I could make a different choice. I started to see the choices I was making. I was my mom. I could see my mom in the mirror. And it was like the first dose of accountability. And I feel like accountability opens up the door for some awareness, some acceptance, some acknowledgement, so that you can start taking some different action in your life. But unfortunately, at a young age, I still wasn't in the environment to really cultivate that. I reached out to Saginaw County Mental Health at 15. That was my first experience of helping to heal myself. And then at 19, I reached out to Alcoholics Anonymous to start to acknowledge that I had been doing some things and abusing alcohol. And then I spent some time in that lifestyle. And then I started to understand that it was something deeper that was going on with me. And it wasn't just the substance that I had given so much power to, because I was still hurting on this path to healing. And I didn't quite understand. I was going to therapy, traditional therapy here and there. But what really set the tone when I was 32 years old, I got arrested. And the arrest was a blessing. And I could immediately see divine intervention in my life. And I started to understand how to better take care of myself. I started to understand how to get honest about who I had become, so that I could heal, so that doors could open up for me. And it, in no way, shape, or form, has been a perfect journey, because as you begin to learn more about yourself from the inside out, you realize that maybe you've been doing some physical healing, but you haven't really been doing some spiritual healing, or you start to understand that the body keeps score and you don't know how to breathe. And so I've been in this journey for the last 5 years of really the internal healing that one would have to do to start to recover the brain, breath work, meditation, yoga, learning things like I don't have to be productive at all times, slowing down, not rushing. That's been the healing path for me, because sometimes we get a lot of misinformation online on what healing looks like, and we start grasping at all these different things, again, that is outside of ourselves. So writing, I wrote alongside of Craig Samuels. He is a ghostwriter in Flint, Michigan. And we took this journey that was supposed to be I'd say about 3 to 6 months. And it took us about 1.5 years to write that book, because I didn't understand all the blind spots that I had. I didn't understand the disruption I was going to feel on the inside. I didn't realize he was going to question some things to make me look deeper inside of myself. I started to understand some more patterns that I had been acting out. I started to hear my children in ways that I hadn't heard them before. I started to see my son as my 15, 16-year-old self and the behaviors that he was displaying. So there was just deeper levels of healing that took place in this writing, but it was also a lot of disruption in my own family by telling stories that people didn't want to be told. And no matter how you told them, people still understood that you were talking about them. And so sometimes healing comes with some isolation that you didn't necessarily plan on. The writing process for me was freeing in ways that I still feel myself shrink at times, even in this space today. But once I'm really able to tap into the power of transformation and the healing that I really have done in my life, I go, okay, yeah, the writing, the storytelling, the being able to connect, the being able to be the safe space for others, to continue to learn how to be the safe space for myself. And for my children, and just creating that space for someone else to say, I've done that too. I was abused and I became abusive, and now I'm in the space of healing. If we could create that space for people. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for that. You are such a powerhouse. And when I listen to you, there are very few things that happen that we can't turn it into something good if we just have the will and the tools to be able to do that. And so, of course, who would not like to have a world where we could come up with one public education campaign and eliminate ACEs? But unfortunately, that's not the reality we live in. But as we know better, we can do better. I will say this: it's not always easy to tell your story. I know as a child, I talked way too much, and some things that families just don't want to talk about, that they sort of, talk in hushed tones or look the other way. When you lift them up, it's not always received well. Sometimes you can blame victims in families who are talking about childhood trauma, and so that can make it hard to break those cycles of silence. And so, Jimmy, when you talk about your story, you're pretty open with your story. And I'm curious to know, when you talk about your lived experience, do you get pushback from your other siblings? You said there were 6 of you, or
No.
people who are like, why are you telling that story? Or are there people that really helped you get through that as a young person and be able to come out the other end open and willing to share and be vulnerable?
No, that was a difficult process for me. It's interesting. I didn't talk a lot about what had happened to me because I didn't want my brothers to carry my shame when they weren't ready to do that. I didn't know what they had told their spouses. At one point, I made an admission of something that was public and kind of embarrassed my brothers as a result of that, and it just made me shut down even more. But it wasn't. I talked about watching my mother kill my uncle. Uh, it was like 4 years ago. I had this nightmare, and I finally did it. I finally called my auntie, who was the surviving widow, and I called my uncle, who was the surviving brother of my mother, and I confronted him. I said, I've been living in this hell for so long. You have got it. Did I see what I saw? And there was just this quiet, this dead silence when I told them what I had saw, and they were like, yeah, that happened. And I got to tell you, I had this rush of emotion. Like I couldn't even catch my breath. It's so funny because even talking about this, I don't want people to get the wrong idea. Like, this stuff still hurts. It does. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I also learned that there's a difference between getting past something and getting over something. I think I have certainly gotten past a lot. I don't know how much of that I've overcome or will get over. And that was one of them. But I think the thing that really transformed me, that changed me completely, was my sister's murder. I still carry, and that gets painful to talk about, but I still, and that was in 1980. My sister was 17 years old, and she had got turned out. I was just off to college. That's a long story. I'm not going to get into that, but I was just off to college, and I always had this goal that I was going to go back and get my sister. My sister, when my mother gave us up, I was 12 years old. My mother gave us up. We spent time in the Pasadena juvenile home because nobody wanted us, me and my brothers. Finally, my grandparents adopted us. So we were in one ward of the Pasadena juvenile home, and the bad kids were in the other. But we all went in the same door and came out the same door. So we were just bad kids, right? And so we kind of acted like it as well. But when I finally got out of Flint after all that time, again, one wanted, I swore I was going to come back and get my sister. But my sister she was a prostitute, and there was a big headline in Flint when she was murdered, saying the star is dead, right on the front page. I still carry that with me every day. I still carry it with me because it motivates me every single day. And it carries my shame that I didn't get back to my sister in time to save her life. So all the stuff that I've done in the community, if you ever look at, I've served on 32 board of directors in this community, but it's not resume padding. If you look at my pattern, Underground Railroad, Shelter House, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, the Can Council, Child and Family, Eastside Soup Kitchen, Hidden Harvest. If you look at my community service, it's my sister. I still feel like I'm trying to save somebody else's sister. But it helped me heal too, because I carried a lot of anger. I got to tell you, when I was in Flint and we were in that funeral home, I felt with this rage, like I wanted to kill somebody. And I was getting married. My sister was supposed to be in our wedding. I was getting married in 3 weeks to my college sweetheart, who was pregnant with my first son. And I knew I had to get off that porch, and I knew I had to get out of Flint because I knew if I stayed in Flint, I wouldn't be here. I knew that because I was just full of rage. But I vowed when I went off that porch, I said, I'm going to redeem my sister, because they were so embarrassed about my sister. And I carry that with me too, her obituary. They changed the E on her name. So, and her name was Tracy Irene Maxine Green. And they didn't give her middle names in the obituary. They took off the E and they called her Tracy Green without the E on the end of Green, trying to disassociate themselves from her because she was this prostitute. And I swore to God, I said, I'm going to get that goddamn E back on that name. And I vowed at that time that when people saw that Green name, that there would be an E on the end of it. And to this very day, I don't let anybody misspell my name. If you spell my name without the E on the end, I will correct you, send it back to you, and you put the E on the end of my name. People know me, but they don't know me. They don't understand me. And you have to understand me to know me. There are people who make a lot of assumptions about me, and that's my fault, because I show them what they want to see. But they don't get to see the real me. The healing part of me was understanding my parents. That's how I finally found this liberation. I went back and I thought about my parents. My mother was 16 years old. My dad was 17 years old. My dad used to sing with Smokey Robinson. Before they were Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, they grew up. And when they were traveling, and when my father got my mother pregnant, my grandmother, my paternal grandmother said, "You're not having a bastard." So they forced them to marry. I was that child. And so those dreams, my mother never got to work. My dad, as Smokey Robinson became famous, I knew that that's why he drank. My mother drank because she never got a chance to live her dreams. And I finally realized all that stuff was healing for me when I realized that they didn't stand a chance, and that my mother took those frustrations out on me. Because I was the first child. I was the one who killed the dreams. It was all that stuff, and again, so when I keep talking about this discovery part of me, I think these trained psychiatrists and these trained social workers can appreciate why I keep saying the discovery part of me, because I feel like I've healed to a point where transparency for me is controlling my narrative. And that for me was the most important thing in the world. Like, I'll control my narrative. I'll tell you what's out there. And there was a liberation in that, and not having that catch up to me. Like, when people would say, well, he was abused, people would say, well, I already knew that. Well, his sister was a prostitute. Yeah, I already knew that. That liberation of telling my truth probably was the greatest source of healing for me. And if there's any man out there who has something that they don't want to get it out before it catches up to you. And the liberation from that is amazing. It really is. Like, you're not afraid of that anymore. You might have other fears, but afraid of your truth catching up with you is something that's gone. You muted yourself again. You're good at that.
You know what? I keep doing that because I don't want to. I have a large dog at home who is making a bunch of noise. And I don't want to abuse him because he won't be quiet. But you know what? You all have just shared so much about just not only how ACE impacts us from a clinical perspective, but from a lived perspective. And I'm just so happy that we're able to shine a light on ways that you can heal, that there is hope, And while we've shared some of our individual experiences, I would like to think that we can sort of transpose that individual journey onto our larger community. And so I would really like to shift a little bit and talk about collective healing and what role does community play in it? Because again, sometimes when we almost normalize or accept behaviors that are not protective, that are not useful, and we just perpetuate cycles. And so my hope is that we're going to interrupt the cycle, and that we will use community and culture and connection to help address some of these traumas that are just not going away if they're going unaddressed. So I'll throw out this question to any of the panelists. Why is it important to include schools, churches, barber shops, and community groups, and whoever will listen and be a part in a discussion about ACEs?
Before I answer that, Dr. Pam, I wanted to respond to Jimmy. I thought your story was so beautiful. It was transformative. And one thing I get concerned about as we talk about ACEs, that we're talking about people being victims and what they've gone through. And it's so important that we allow each individual to tell their story the way they want to tell it. They have to reclaim that narrative. That gives you the power to change your life, and it actually helps us as professionals to know how to continue to help you. So thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry I didn't really answer your question, Dr. Pam. I had to respond to that.
Oh, yeah. I'll restate, each one of us is different. Do you know what I mean? And I'm glad that we have people who are willing to tell their story, to face it, write books, write poems, be empowered. But there are other people who choose to advocate in a different way, and you'll never maybe know how their advocacy is showing up. And so I guess I want to talk about how we heal as a community and how we accept each of us where we are, and what can we do in our own, even if it's just ideas, what can we do if we know that ACEs are impacting our community at large, and they're showing up in school, they're showing up in work, they're showing up in relationships, they're showing up in the hospitals and the family. Like, what can we do as a community so that everybody can be a part of breaking these cycles in their own way, in whatever they have to give?
Well,
go ahead.
I just think creating those safe spaces, recognizing the differences, but yet the similarities in which we all kind of are attached to in some ways, but providing places for individuals to allow, as Mr. Green said, be vulnerable, tell their truth and tell what happened to them without being punished or being looked upon and looked down on because that happened to you. So I just think those places, the schools, the churches, the barbershops, you get more barbershop psychiatrists and psychologists, and same as the cosmetologists as well too. You get those clusters of individuals that come together and talk about things, maybe in a roundabout fashion, but for some reason that semblance of feeling safe to say how something is at the barbershop or at the beauty shop, again, just giving people the grace and the mercy and the place to be safe to talk about that narrative and to control what they want said and done regarding the narrative.
Yeah, I think it's important to make Black men understand, and maybe even men, period. But we're talking to predominantly a Black constituency, and to me, like you have to, and we have to do this. There's a thing in me that makes me the strongest person I know, and I know, and the humility in me is I'm nobody special. Like, I'm just one of hundreds, thousands like me, right? But the pride in me is that I don't have to worry about how I'll get through hell because I've been there. Mm-hmm. I also know a perspective, and especially it's important for men to understand what a bad day is. Like I have, and people talk about my personality, I'm always bubbly and all. Well, I have bad moments, but it is rare that I have a bad day. And when people understand what I've been through in life, and I'm not alone, these Black men that I know personally who have had hell in their lives too, it gives you a different perspective. Now, some people would call it resiliency. And it probably is that. That's a good word for it. But perspective is critical. When you realize what you've come through, the stuff you face today, a disgruntled worker, you didn't get a raise. I mean, those kind of things, those are the kind of things that are so minimized when you consider all the hell you've been through to even get here. And you keep, and Dr. Pam, you kept asking me, how'd you get here? It's through those pathways where that stuff doesn't matter. That stuff doesn't keep you derailed. That stuff, like, you just feel like for me, honestly, I'm surprised I'm here. Like, it stuns me sometimes. I pinch myself when I'm in a room full of important people. I've been in the White House. I've been around these important legislators and all that. And I got to tell you, seriously, I pinch myself all the time. Like, sooner or later, I still have that kind of thing. Like, somebody's going to figure out, what the hell is he doing here? But I think that's the thing we need to talk to men about, because I know I'm not by myself, and encouraging them to have that kind of pride about the fact that they're even there. They're in the barbershop. They're in these places where they're not in jail. They're not in prison. And I know so many of them have come through a lot of different rough spots, and we need to encourage that kind of thing. To me, like, it's not shame, it's pride. You need to change. It's not shame, it's pride. Like, don't be ashamed of what you've come through. Have pride in that you've come through it. That's how we need to change this narrative. I'm off the soapbox.
So changing the narrative, and I'm thinking hard and long about this, because Dr. Kai, you talked about how long we've been knowing about adverse childhood experiences, and as a fellow academic, I'm always interested in research and what academics are teaching us about. And so we know adverse childhood experiences existed long before someone coined the phrase adverse childhood experiences, and then told us about PACEs and protective factors we can put in place. But there are times when I feel like we've got more knowledge than we've ever had before, but we still aren't making the progress that you would think one would make when you have the knowledge, when someone's named it, when you've talked about things. And I'm not ashamed to say it. I grew up raising my kids the best way I knew how, and I raised them the way I was raised because that's what I knew how to do. And I can't tell you how many times my beloved mother, who is now 91 years old and I love, her advice to me was, you don't beat those boys enough. You know what I mean? That's the problem. You don't beat them enough. Now, the stuff that my mother would have thought was just good old parent, and don't get me wrong, I was disciplined, not beaten and abused. I know the difference. But people really struggle with this stuff. And that's why we continue to do things in front of our children. We continue to do things to our children that clinicians and psychologists and others would tell us are just inappropriate. And I'm going to say it because there are people out there who would say all that book stuff is actually creating a soft generation. And so I don't want anyone to leave here not understanding what we're trying to say about ACEs and how they are not only eroding the family and causing trauma in kids, but also causing a collective trauma in our communities where we don't have that sort of cohesion that we used to have when we were all on the same page. You know that story they love to tell? When I was a kid, the whole community raised me. You know what I'm saying? And so now I just don't want to leave people with the misconception that there is not hope for healing. And I'm not talking about a success story here and a success story there, but that our whole community has to be a part of this reculturing and denormalizing ACEs being okay. I mean, I don't know. I guess I got on my soapbox a little bit because I do believe when we know better, we should do better. But knowing better doesn't always produce different results if we aren't giving people clear strategies for how to put those protective factors in place intentionally for children and families. So
A very good point, Dr. Pam. I struggle with that as well. We have all this education, we have the knowledge, but is it being translated into actual changes in our community? And I think the verdict is still out on that. And I think there's several factors. First of all, there's so many factors in the community that we can't control. Lack of housing, lack of jobs, increase in racism, increase in discrimination, lack of green spaces, more liquor stores in our neighborhoods, more cannabis stores in our neighborhood, not being able to go to the park, pollution. I mean, all those external factors that we can't control. And then you have professionals that tell you, we don't need to mitigate, you don't need to continue to perpetuate these ACEs. But we have to have the community trust. And that's what I think we're building tonight, hopefully, is that we are here together. We're not above you. We all are victims of ACEs. We all have gone through this. And we're here with you to walk the walk with you and help you to figure out how we get past this. So by having these conversations in the community, I think we can start by having honest conversations. And I think that a lot of times as professionals, we're in our offices and not in the community where we need to be. We need to be able to have therapy sessions at churches, at barbershops, at the community centers. So that's my soapbox.
Well, I actually appreciate you saying that because, I'm seeing a little bit of shift. The fact that we have this panel convened in this way, the fact that the Michigan Public Health Institute wanted a community-led, ACEs education campaign, I think that the powers that be are starting to realize that you can't transform communities without centering the voices of community members. And I know I spent a lot of years in school becoming Dr. Ross. And I quickly learned many years ago that if I didn't immerse myself in community, you'll get out of touch with the communities that gave birth to you. You'll start thinking that the ways of thinking, the ways of researching, the ways of creating knowledge in higher education somehow are, have more credibility than listening to the people. And so I appreciate you saying what you're saying, because in as much as we've thrown lots and lots and lots of money into interventions and education campaigns, when we're not seeing that we're getting a return on investment, we have to go back to the root cause and say, are we actually enlisting the voices, enlisting the lived experiences, meeting people where they are instead of expecting them to come to us? And so hopefully this conversation will begin to get the word out so that people can have this conversation in multiple places in the community where they can take root and be a catalyst for that transformation that we know needs to happen. And so I just really appreciate all of the perspective. And don't get me wrong, as much as I like being someone who can walk both worlds, there's room for all of us. We need academics doing research and showing us, what the research is telling and what the patterns are. But we also need people sharing their lived experience so that, it converts into stuff that resonates with everyone. And I can tell you, ACEs touch everyone. People assume if you come out the other end and you don't drink, or you've written a book, or you've gone to school, that you have not been impacted by that stuff. And that is a neat misnomer. As I started studying more about ACEs are an equal opportunity traumatizer, and so I just hope that if people don't leave with anything, is that, we want to leave you in a place of knowledge, but also in a place of hope. So as we march into our last segment and we begin to talk a little bit about what parents listening or caregivers listening to this education campaign might need to know if they feel stuck or afraid to ask for help, what are some things that they might, that we might wish for every caregiver, every community member to understand about trauma and healing, because this is definitely work that needs to be done across the entire community. So Dr. Kai, what would a trauma-informed Saginaw look like from a systems perspective. And I think you hinted at it a little bit before when you talk about shifting where we do business and how we meet people where they are. But are there other things that one might expect to see in a trauma-informed Saginaw from a systems perspective?
I think we're getting there. I think this conversation is one of the steps. I've worked with the Michigan ACE initiatives. They do a lot of ACE work in the community. HELP is doing a lot of work in the community. I listen to a group of Saginaw pastors on the radio. They're working with youth that are involved in the justice system. They're doing work in the community. So essentially, a trauma-informed system in Saginaw will be every system looks at individuals with a trauma-informed lens. For example, that child that keeps getting in trouble, instead of asking that child, what's wrong with you? Ask that child, what happened to you? Or what is happening to you? How can I help? That individual that can't keep a job, ask them, what are your barriers? How can I help you keep that job? Individuals that are involved in the criminal and juvenile justice system, individuals that are involved in drug court, they should all have trauma evaluations to find out why are they involved in the system? Why are they involved in drug court? What kind of obstacles have they had in their life? What kind of help can we give them? You mentioned schools. We need to have trauma. We're getting there in schools as well. We need to have trauma-informed care at schools. We don't need to send children home when they act out. We need to keep them in school and provide that safe space for them in school and find out what they need. So those are just some of the ideas about what a trauma-informed system looks like. And if I can just show the last slide, Julian. With 6 principles of trauma-informed care, that you have to have safety first. Individuals that feel safe, that feel that you care about them, they will talk and they will get help and they'll feel supported. You have to be transparent, as so many people have said today. If you're not transparent, if you're not able to talk about what happened, you're not going to be able to move past it. You've got to have support. It has to be a collaborative involvement with the community, with the providers, with the caregivers. And finally, individuals have to feel empowered and their voice has to be heard and has to be their choice as to how they heal. And it's so important that we don't ignore those cultural, those historical, those gender issues that contribute to the trauma. So finally, I like to say that a trauma-informed system, you can take the slide down, thank you, will have everyone involved in an equal way, each contributing to helping individuals to move through the trauma and to get better.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So one of the things that we are planning with our campaign is that we will also be creating a newsletter where people who want to get more information about ACEs or do like a little self-assessment about ACEs or PACEs, they can get some more information because, when you're armed with good information, I think it's easier to start to address these issues that we've been talking about. Dana, do you know of any other resources that families might be able to gain access to that would support them in learning more about ACEs and PACEs?
Well, again, I know they have, they do have there was some training at CMH at one point in time that was part of like the family resource center that they had there. So I don't know. I know since COVID, some things have changed and how that information is being disseminated that way. A lot of the other community areas that you've already mentioned, and definitely that's on our little runner down there. You got, NAMI and the CMU, behavioral health and community mental health. Those are areas that I know that have specifically really, promote what ACEs are all about and how can we start changing some things. Oddly enough, and somebody will say, wow, DHS is actually instituting programming to also help with the changing that image of them, as well as making it more community oriented. And a couple of the programs that I'm a part of as well too, and that's the Neighborhood Anchor program. And that is a program that was been designed under the previous director, Jen Shores. She and a few of her administrative colleagues, they got together and came up with this Neighborhood Anchor program, which allows them to identify individuals, seniors in different community groups and community areas. And they're a point of reference for those young mothers and young fathers and young folks in the neighborhood, where they can go and get information without stigma or feeling looked down upon, and also be able to say, hey, this is what's going on. Because if you live in a neighborhood that is in tune with everyone, for the most part, you pretty much know what's happening in the houses across the street, next to you, and down the road. And so this is another way that, the revamping and the restructuring of DHS is also looking at how can we start to get the community to trust systems, but trust each other. So if you start learning and start providing a space where they can start to come together and talk and start, or have those porch conversations, that senior individuals in the chair and they rocking back and forth, and she comes and sits, young lady or young man comes sits on the stairs there, and then they're talking. It's that informal opportunity to conversate, that they're getting formal information that's going to help, to change their life. Help them acquire skills that they didn't have, help them to promote themselves and empower them to ask a question. How can I get that type of help? How can I seek out what I need to become a better person, become a better parent, as opposed to, use that phrase, that Karen, who goes and calls CPS. Yes, I see she's doing this to her child. She's doing that. Because you don't understand people. We may be brown and black people, but culturally we come from different origins and different perspectives of life. And others don't necessarily know that. So right away, that assumption or, the lack of understanding who we are, as Mr. Green said, just understanding me, then you can start to appreciate our differences. And that in itself is, the neighborhood anchoring program is really awesome. And I think that's a very forward movement for a big system such as DHS to be doing in the community. So I'm really excited about being a part of that, and definitely promoting as much as that every opportunity I get to let folks know there's things out here, and their systems are revamping because they realize that ACEs and the importance of PCEs and having just people come together and connect and talk, and people come together and not be judged, and lessen the umbrella of stigma for asking for help.
All right. Thank you for that, because, there are resources out there, and we would never want folks to be underserved because they don't just know about resources. Of course, we know a big part of help is helping oneself too. You got to take advantage of resources. And so, Teresina, I'll turn to you and ask if what would you say to your younger self, or to a child that's listening who is growing up in chaos, about what they can do to weather that storm, I guess you could say? You're muted.
Thank you. To a child in chaos, or even myself, my child self, you are not the chaos around you. You are not the yelling. You are not the silence. You are not the confusion or the pain. You are not broken. You are growing through something that no child should have to go through. And even in this chaos, your life matters. You deserve peace. You deserve safety. And none of this is your fault. Grown-ups are supposed to protect and guide you. You are not supposed to protect and guide them. When they don't, it is not because you failed. It is because they did. But you can still become everything you were meant to be. You are not alone, and you are deeply loved, even if no one has told you it lately.
Wow. Thank you for that. All right, Mr. Green, what would you say to the men in the audience who heard your story, perhaps for the first time, and or young men who were listening who may feel invisible and are also living in various iterations of chaos. He said, I'm leaving. There he is. He's back.
I'm back. I wish I had words, because like you said earlier, everybody is so uniquely different. But, I was thinking about that younger self and listening to Teresina. I was thinking about that because that's something I say to my kids too. And I always say to them that some of the best days of your life haven't even happened yet, to just keep them focused on a future for those men who are struggling right now. The liberation is within you. It really is, and I'm a testament to it. It's just uttering the truth. I had a great talk with a guy, Phil Ike, we call it the sidewalk talk, and I said to him, it's funny. You learn to lie because it becomes protective, and you don't realize how much you've suffocated yourself until you actually tell the truth. And then it just comes out of you like you would not believe. And it's like almost like a rebirth. Like you don't even know who that is, but the discovery part of that and just being truthful about your life's experiences, who you are, how it hurts, that pain, all those things that control your own narrative. It is the most liberating thing you could ever have, but it also gives you a power, that power of self. And I said that earlier, and I'm going to keep repeating it. You don't ever have to worry about what's catching up to you. You already caught it. You've already, and I heard that word victim. I have to admit that I probably was a little bit overboard with not wanting to be a victim. When I think about my mom and my dad, it never worked. I've never been unemployed a day in my life. The poverty, hunger, all those things that I grew up in, I went out of my way to not have those things. But what I would help young men understand now is balance, because I was so focused on child. I ignored my spouse. My kids had never, ever seen me hit a woman. They've never seen me drink. And those are all the things I thought were, the things I was supposed to do. What I didn't know was, no, you're supposed to show a woman love. You're supposed to show a woman that you're an equal partner. You're supposed to show emotion. You're supposed to stay in there and fight. And it's a delicate balance. But when you don't have that, when you're so blinded by making sure your kids never, ever experience the hell you went through, it becomes a silo. You don't know it, and you think you're doing all the right things, but you're not. And so I would just tell these young men that today, men, period, that there's a balance in life. And that at the end of the day, putting your hand on the door handles where you work and the door handles where you live, if you're ready to kick that damn door in because you're so excited about what's behind them, that's when you found that peace. And right now we have men out there who probably have one or maybe no door handles that they can touch and find a peace in. But it just first starts with the truth inside of you that you've been holding and hiding for so long. Let it go. Let it go. Because again, the pride in being where you are, as opposed to being locked away, strung out on drugs, or any number of things that could have befallen you, that's a pride, man. That is not a shame thing. That's a damn good thing. And we need to have more people express that, because we're nobody special. We're just one of millions, And I just happen to be one who just found the ability to, articulate it and talk about it. And again, it just helps me through that part.
All right. Well, I must tell you, I am so thankful to this amazing panelist group that we have had tonight. It gives me great pride and peace to be someone who's grown up in Saginaw most of my life. And I can tell you that healing is possible and that help is available. We are hopeful that our listeners who may want more information on ACEs will connect with some of the resources that we put out there, as well as visit www.womenofcolors.org. And we just want to thank you for tuning in and listening. Until next time, stay encouraged and stay connected. Thank you all so very much.